Hello, welcome again to Give and Take, where we look at the latest scientific issues to help equip you to be able to share the gospel with confidence. And today I'm joined by Rana and AJ Roberts, and we're going to tackle an important question. The idea that if the heavens declare the glory of God, why are so many scientists atheists? Fuzz, AJ, good to have you here today.
Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
So, I kind of hear this claim where there's this kind of pervasive idea that, from the Christians, we know that from the Bible, we know that the heavens declare the glory of God, but yet it seems like all the scientists are atheists. So what do we do with this claim that if the heavens declare the glory of God, that all these scientists are atheists?
Yeah, I think it's a claim that's not really substantiated by the scientists that I know.
How so? Flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, so I think most of the people that I know in science, if they have a basic faith, it's just something that doesn't sort of enter into the scientific process or the discussions, and so they kind of keep their scientific work independent from their religious beliefs. And
so does that mean that they may or may not be religious, but that just doesn't play into their science, or does that mean that they typically aren't religious and so they just separate the two?
Yeah, I think it's that they may or may not be.
Okay.
And if you want to get down to how many people have a faith and how many people don't have a faith and what faith do they have, then I think maybe I might punt to somebody like Elaine Eklund, who wrote the book, Science versus Religion, and she's talking about how even people who say that they don't have a belief in God still have some sort of spiritual sense from time to time, either when they're doing their work or they're out in nature. So
there's kind of a religious nature to it, even if they may claim that they don't believe in a God, if you will.
For many, there are. Okay. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, if you look at the survey data, depending on the discipline, but roughly about 30 to 35% of scientists will express belief in a personal God, and another 15% would express belief in a higher power. And so at most, you're looking at maybe 50% of scientists being atheists in that sense. And my experience, when you engage many of those scientists, oftentimes they will, by default, identify themselves as atheists, but they haven't really thought about.
So what do you mean by default there?
So in other words, if you present to these scientists evidence for God's existence from science, they would oftentimes say, that's just a theological observation. I don't think about theology. I'm a scientist.
So that would kind of go to AJ's point that there's these kind of two separate realms that people almost work
right.
in.
Yeah. And a lot of times they don't think about it. But I would agree with AJ. In my experience as a biochemist, it was routine for my colleagues when I was working in university labs or in industry labs to marvel at the nature of the cell's chemistry. This is amazing. This is cool. Mm-hmm. It was almost a religious response. So, I think scientists do have that religious or spiritual orientation to nature, but they still might identify themselves as atheists.
Yeah, I don't know the statistics well enough to comment on Fuzz's reference to them, but to me it seems like, sort of atheism by default is still sort of overstating the reality of my experience with my colleagues, right? I would say many of them, like Fuzz said, are philosophically just not sensitive. Mm-hmm. And if you actually start to talk to them, maybe over a break or a lunch or something, then you actually find out they're pretty agnostic. They sort of have this, I haven't really thought about it, it's not really part of my daily routine. So.
Yeah, and I find that, one thing to help people like that get beyond this idea that that's theology, I just don't think about it, I just focus on science, is to start to ask them things that deal with the ultimate nature of reality. Start to ask them more philosophically oriented questions, and what do you think about this? And just to try to get them to start thinking in those terms. And I find that oftentimes they are more than willing to engage in some pretty intense, but I think open conversations about
Absolutely.
those issues.
Yeah.
You just have to get their interest piqued.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I want to come back and, that's kind of where I want to end is, what can we do to help engage or help be able to engage people well? And, it seems to me there's some of them that they just don't want to think about or haven't really thought about it much. Others who that's just a different realm. But there's also, there are a number of scientists who are just legitimate atheists, that they say there is no God. And some would claim that there's no scientific evidence. And There's often a claim that circulates in the church, and I think we've probably made it here at RTB to some extent, that a lot of times that's just trying to avoid a personal rebellion or living in rebellion against God. What do we do with that?
I think there are scientists who have made those kind of statements. Some of them are prominent, but I think we want to be very careful to make sweeping generalizations. That just because there's some outspoken atheists that have co-opted science in that way, that reflects everybody who's in the scientific community, because that's definitely not true.
Yeah, I mean, that's been my experience. I mean, there are occasional people I've run that are just rebellious or outspoken, but a lot of times it's more reflective, thoughtful, and are willing to engage in conversations with you.
If you're reaching out to somebody who's a scientist or is scientifically minded, one thing that you must avoid doing is drawing conclusions with a high degree of confidence.
Yes.
If you say, for example, the scientific evidence indicates that God must exist, scientists will push back against that just on principle alone. But if you say,
I can relate to that.
Yes, but if you say that the scientific data is consistent with God's existence, or is in harmony with God's existence, or doesn't challenge God's existence,
so true. Yeah.
then you'll have a very different conversation. Yeah. So people have to be aware that maybe sometimes the resistance to the evidence isn't that the evidence is lacking or that person is hard-hearted. It's just your approach hasn't been sensitive to how scientists react to absolute statements.
So beyond just being sensitive to the absolute statements, what other things can we do? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things you got to pay attention to.
Well, I think what's really critical is that you don't react to the statement, right? You're not going to sort of reason your way to getting them to think differently. So don't respond so much to their assertion, respond to the person, right? And I think the way you respond to the person is you ask questions, So if you're an atheist and you just made this statement that you made earlier, a very appropriate way, I think, to respond would be, well, that's really interesting. What's led you to such firm beliefs? Right? Because then I'm starting to respond to the person, and I'm going to invite them to start to articulate what's important to them. And that's going to help me understand, are they coming at this because they don't want a God that's going to tell them how to live their lives? Or have they really thought through this and they're just convinced, maybe it's a problem of evil for them and not a problem of personal autonomy, right? So
it's really just kind of about building relationships with a person, if you will.
Yeah.
And I find that to be a tremendously freeing thing, because there's lots of reasons why people may not think about God or say God doesn't exist or just not even want to think about God. But as we engage in relationship, as we ask questions, as we explore why are they interested in God or have they thought about this, we're able to have conversations about the gospel, bring who Christ is and what the Bible has to say about things into those conversations in a way that invites conversations where we're sharing the gospel and allowing God to do the work of changing the heart. And that's what we're called to do.